The moment I heard the words, they landed like a punch to the chest. "You need to leave, now." He didn't even look me in the eye, his voice flat, devoid of any warmth or hesitation, carrying the kind of certainty that only comes from someone who believes they own the world. I froze in place, my hands gripping the edge of the kitchen counter so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The air felt suddenly heavier, as if the walls themselves were pressing down, watching silently as the life I thought I shared with him unraveled in a single sentence. I wanted to speak, to argue, to demand some explanation, but the words lodged in my throat. All I could do was stare at him, at the smug set of his jaw, at the casual arrogance in the way he leaned against the doorway, as though this entire household was his stage, and I was nothing more than an uninvited actor. For years I had noticed the small cracks, the tiny fractures in what everyone else would have called a perfect marriage. The way he would dismiss my suggestions with a patronizing smile, the way he laughed a little too long at his own jokes while brushing off my accomplishments as minor or expected. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was overreacting, that perhaps marriage was just this delicate balancing act of compromise and patience. But today, as I stood in the familiar kitchen that smelled faintly of his cologne, those cracks felt like gaping chasms. Every passing moment confirmed a truth I had refused to confront. He had been eroding the foundation of our relationship piece by piece, with deliberate care, and now he expected me to simply step aside, to vanish like I was never here. There was a surreal quality to the scene, as if I had walked into someone else's life without realizing it. The house, which had been our shared space, suddenly felt like his fortress, every corner a reminder that this was his domain. The way he stood there, arms crossed, eyes scanning me with that cold, dismissive judgment, made it clear he had rehearsed this moment in his mind. He was a man convinced of his own righteousness, and he believed that demanding my departure was not cruelty, it was order. My mind raced, replaying the countless little indignities I had ignored, the moments I had tried to bend and adjust to keep the peace, the silent sacrifices I had made while he accumulated the comfort of arrogance and entitlement. The betrayal now felt almost cinematic, cruelly framed by the morning light streaming through the windows, highlighting the contrast between his calm control and my sudden raw vulnerability. I wanted to scream. I wanted to storm out immediately, to leave the house and erase the humiliation from my mind. But there was something in me that refused to submit so easily. A quiet, simmering awareness that, despite his confidence, this was not a simple eviction. It was a challenge, a test of what I was willing to accept. The thought struck me sharply. He had no idea how much power I still held, how many unseen foundations I had laid over the years, the quiet threads of control he had assumed I was blind to. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of something I hadn't acknowledged in myself for a long time. The ability to reclaim what was mine, not through anger alone, but through calculated, unshakable resolve. He smirked as though reading my hesitation, as though he could see the flicker of confusion and disbelief that crossed my face. "I mean it," he said again, this time with a hint of impatience, tapping his fingers against the frame of the doorway. The sound echoed in the kitchen, sharp and insistent, like a gavel marking a judgment I hadn't yet fully processed. I realized in that instant that his morality, or lack thereof, was irrelevant. He was a man who had built his own narrative, one in which he could betray, manipulate, and belittle without consequence. The audacity of his confidence was staggering, and yet beneath it, I sensed a fragile arrogance, a vulnerability disguised by bravado. I took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling my heart pound with a mixture of shock, indignation, and the first tentative stirrings of clarity. This was the moment that defined everything to come. Every instinct I had spent years suppressing, my need for validation, my loyalty, my desire to please, clashed violently with a newly awakened sense of agency. I realized that leaving passively, walking out into the world while he continued to smugly believe he held all the cards, was no longer an option. There was a choice before me: retreat into invisibility, or confront the situation with a quiet, unyielding strength that he could not possibly anticipate. Memories of past slights, past humiliations rushed through my mind, each one sharper now, each one a tiny dagger reminding me of how easily he had assumed control. I remembered the evenings when he would dismiss my contributions at dinner parties, the mornings when he would take my patience for granted, the countless subtle manipulations that had conditioned me to defer to his ego. Every single one of those moments now appeared in stark contrast to the growing realization that I still had power, that his perception of dominance was built on a false premise. It was as if the entire narrative he had constructed to justify his behavior was collapsing in the quiet, tense space between us. I could feel the shift begin inside me. Subtle at first, like the slow warming of the sun against a cold morning, there was an awakening, a recognition that the humiliation I felt was not permanent, that it could be transformed into leverage. The house, which had suddenly seemed like his fortress, was in reality a reflection of my diligence, my foresight, and my quiet strength. Every room, every corner, every document tucked away in filing cabinets was a testament to the control he assumed he had, but in truth had never fully claimed. The power dynamic, though hidden from his view, had always been balanced more evenly than he dared to imagine. His impatience grew, his smirk widening into something almost predatory, as though he sensed the flicker of resistance but could not yet name it. "I don't have time for this," he said, voice sharp, threatening, echoing around the kitchen like a judge delivering a sentence. And in that moment, the realization crystallized. This confrontation was not just about leaving or staying. It was about asserting a truth he could not yet comprehend, that the assumptions he had made about my compliance, my passivity, and my place in his world were fundamentally flawed. He had underestimated me, and that miscalculation, subtle though it might seem, carried consequences he was entirely unprepared for. I swallowed hard, feeling the lump of tension in my throat, the dizzying mix of fear, anger, and a burgeoning sense of empowerment. I recognized the stark contrast between his arrogance and my rising clarity, between his sense of entitlement and the quiet, calculated control I had always maintained. For a brief, suspended moment, it felt as if time itself had slowed, the world narrowing down to the two of us, and the unspoken battle of wills unfolding in the kitchen. Every instinct screamed caution. Yet another part of me whispered that this was precisely the moment to stop being cautious, to stop being invisible, to stop allowing someone else's assumptions to define my worth. As I looked at him, I felt a wave of resolve settle in my chest. I was no longer just the wife he thought he could dismiss with a casual command. I was the holder of truths he had failed to see, the steward of the home he believed he could dominate, and the architect of the consequences that would inevitably follow. The anger was there, yes, but it was tempered by calculation. The humiliation burned, but it was now fuel, not defeat. And in that clarity, a choice emerged that was both terrifying and exhilarating. I could step forward, reclaim my space, and let the full weight of my presence, and of his misjudgment, land exactly where it belonged. The seconds stretched, tense and silent until I finally moved, not in retreat, but in a slow, deliberate step that carried more power than any shout or accusation could. He blinked, just once, surprised by the subtle shift in my demeanor, as if he had finally glimpsed the truth that had been there all along. And in that brief electric moment, I understood that the real story was only just beginning, that the confrontation he demanded would unfold in ways he could never anticipate. The choice had been made, quietly but decisively, to no longer surrender my power. I stood there, breathing steadily, feeling the weight of every slight, every betrayal, and every assumption he had made crash together with the realization of my own strength. It was a fragile, exhilarating clarity, the kind that comes once in a lifetime when humiliation and empowerment collide, when betrayal and revelation intersect, and when a single decision can reshape the entire trajectory of your life. And as I looked at him, arrogant and unaware, I knew with a cold, unshakable certainty that leaving passively was no longer an option, and that what followed would leave him, not me, in shock. The air between us was charged, a quiet tension humming like a wire under pressure. He shifted, perhaps sensing the change but unable to articulate it, unable to grasp the subtle power I now held. And I realized that the real battle was not loud or explosive. It was quiet, deliberate, and infinitely more potent. My mind raced with possibilities, each one a carefully constructed response to years of undermining and deceit. Each step I would take from here would not just defend me, it would redefine the rules of engagement entirely, flipping the balance of control he had taken for granted. And in that suspended moment, standing in the kitchen of a house he assumed was his kingdom, I made the first irrevocable decision. I would not leave. Not today, not ever, without first revealing the truth he had so arrogantly ignored. I would reclaim every ounce of respect, every shred of dignity, and every subtle advantage he had assumed belonged to him. I would transform betrayal into strategy, humiliation into leverage, and his certainty into doubt. And with that choice, the stage was set for a confrontation that would not only change the course of our marriage, but leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about me, and about the life he assumed he controlled. When I first met him, everything felt like a whirlwind of light and charm. He had a smile that could disarm even the most skeptical, words that seemed to dance just for me, and a way of making every conversation feel like it was just the two of us in the world. Our first dates were a blur of laughter and long walks, punctuated by gestures so thoughtful I swore I had found someone who could see straight into my heart. Friends would marvel at how quickly we clicked, and I told myself that chemistry this electric didn't come around often. I was young, yes, and perhaps a little naive, but there was something intoxicating about the way he made me feel seen, desired, and most importantly, loved. Every text, every call, every lingering touch seemed to confirm that I had found someone extraordinary. It felt cinematic, almost like life had scripted him just for me. A hero who arrived at the precise moment my own narrative had grown lonely. Marriage, of course, arrived with a shift that I was slow to notice. The gestures of charm never disappeared entirely, but they became selective, targeted, like brushstrokes highlighting certain parts of the canvas while leaving shadows in the corners. I overlooked those shadows at first, convincing myself that they were trivial. A missed dinner here, a late apology there. When he laughed a little too long at someone else's joke, I told myself it was harmless, that I was perhaps imagining jealousy that had no real place in a mature relationship. But the signs were there, tiny cracks forming beneath the veneer of affection. He had a way of twisting words just enough to make me doubt myself, a subtle undermining that he wrapped in care or humor. I told myself I was sensitive, that perhaps I expected too much. But deep inside, a quiet unease began to grow, an itch at the edge of my consciousness that whispered, "Pay attention. This is not what it seems." I remember the first time I realized his charm could mask something darker. It wasn't a grand revelation. There was no dramatic confrontation or shocking confession. It was in the way he would redirect conversations so that I questioned my own logic, in the way he would compliment me in front of others but dismiss my concerns when we were alone. I began to notice the microaggressions, the way he would interrupt me at gatherings, the way my opinions were met with polite nods while his were lauded as clever or insightful. Even the small betrayals, the surprise meetings he failed to mention, the unexplained absences, the mysterious late-night calls, started to accumulate, like droplets forming a storm cloud above my head. At first, I rationalized everything. Surely, I told myself, a strong marriage includes compromise, patience, and trust. Surely a few inconsistencies didn't define the man I had fallen in love with. But the seed of doubt, once planted, refused to wither. There was a rhythm to our life together, a cadence of routines and roles that I had accepted, sometimes willingly, sometimes without realizing the cost. I managed the household with precision. Bills, schedules, maintenance, and everything that kept our shared world functional. On the surface, he appeared to carry responsibility, but in reality, I quietly maintained control over the aspects that mattered most. Ownership of our home, the financial accounts in my name, and the documentation that kept our legal standing intact, all of it was mine to protect. He had assumed authority, as he had assumed control over many other facets of our life. But in truth, he was often oblivious to the foundation upon which our domestic world was built. It was a delicate balance, one I had perfected through years of quiet diligence and careful oversight. But even as I maintained it, there was an emotional cost I rarely acknowledged. Even the most intimate moments began to carry tension. Subtle as a shadow crossing a sunlit room, I noticed how he would comment on my choices, framing suggestions as critiques while dressing them in humor or care. He had a way of making me question my judgment without seeming confrontational. And yet there were glimpses of the man I had fallen for, tenderness in rare, unguarded moments, warmth that reminded me of why I had said yes at the altar. It was this oscillation between charm and manipulation that kept me tethered, that made me second-guess my unease. The contrast was stark and disorienting. Love interwoven with control, loyalty intertwined with subtle humiliation. I often caught myself excusing his behavior, telling myself that no one was perfect, that compromise was part of marriage, that perhaps I was overthinking what others might see as minor flaws. But the tension, though quiet, never fully dissipated. Financially, I had assumed responsibility cautiously but deliberately. I managed our joint accounts, ensured that taxes were filed correctly, and oversaw the mortgage payments and household expenditures. On the surface, he contributed, but the true authority, the control that underpins security, rested quietly in my hands. I kept the legal documentation carefully stored, knowing that one day, if the foundation of our marriage were ever challenged, I would have the leverage to protect myself. It wasn't about revenge then. It was about foresight, about understanding that love does not absolve one of responsibility. Yet even in those early days, I began to notice his subtle sense of entitlement, the way he assumed that authority and control were natural rights, not privileges earned through diligence or commitment. I chose to let him believe the illusion, a mistake that would become a critical advantage later. Even within the household, the dynamics were revealing. Shared spaces became arenas of unspoken competition and negotiation. He had a tendency to dominate conversation, rearrange priorities to suit his own schedule, and insist upon his preferences as default. Yet I, often quietly, implemented the systems that allowed our life to function seamlessly. I scheduled maintenance, handled deliveries, coordinated social engagements, and navigated the endless minutiae that sustained domestic life. His oblivion to these efforts was both infuriating and revealing. I began to understand, slowly and painfully, that our marriage existed in parallel layers. One visible and performative, the other quiet, deliberate, and entirely under my management. It was in these invisible layers that my control resided, a fact he assumed was mutual but which I knew to be entirely my own. The emotional landscape was no less complex. I gave generously of myself, balancing loyalty and love with the mounting frustration that came from being unheard, unseen, or undervalued. There were nights when I cried silently in our bedroom, wondering whether I had misjudged him, whether the foundations I had worked so hard to maintain were worth the personal cost. I clung to memories of courtship and early marriage, reminding myself that love was not a ledger of grievances, but a commitment to endure and support one another. Yet the betrayals, subtle and cumulative, gnawed at me. Every forgotten anniversary, every dismissed suggestion, every tiny slight etched itself into my consciousness, accumulating into a quiet resentment that I had neither permission nor outlet to express. And still, despite all of this, there were moments of breathtaking beauty and intimacy, fleeting glimpses of the man who had captured my heart in the first place. The first time he kissed me after a long day, the nights when we laughed until we cried over shared memories, the comfort of his presence in moments of quiet reflection, they all lingered, stubbornly and persistently complicating the narrative. These contradictions, the warmth against the cold, the charm against the manipulation, the loyalty against the subtle betrayals, formed the emotional texture of our marriage, one that felt both intensely personal and universally recognizable to anyone who had loved and endured simultaneously. I began to recognize patterns, small but telling. His compliments were often strategic, designed to elicit compliance. His attentiveness had conditions, often aligning with his needs rather than mutual understanding. I noticed how he would casually undermine my choices in front of friends or colleagues, framing it as humor or concern, a tactic that simultaneously embarrassed me and kept me silent. And yet these patterns did not break me. They sharpened my awareness, honed my intuition, and strengthened my capacity for patience and observation. I learned to anticipate his maneuvers, to read the subtle shifts in tone and posture, to understand not just what was said, but what was left unsaid. Ownership of the household became a quiet, almost sacred responsibility. While he assumed comfort and authority, I ensured that the legal and practical realities were aligned with security and foresight. Every bill paid, every document filed, every oversight prevented was a reminder of my agency and capability, though hidden beneath the surface of marital life. I allowed him the illusion of control because I understood that underestimating me was one of the most effective tools in my arsenal. He did not know, and perhaps never suspected, that the power he believed he wielded was conditional, fragile, and, if leveraged, entirely mine to reclaim. Even within the social sphere, the dynamics of manipulation and control were evident. Friends would remark on his charisma, on how smoothly he navigated conversations, and how effortlessly he commanded attention. Meanwhile, I performed the invisible labor, managing logistics, smoothing over conflicts, keeping appearances flawless. The contrast between his perceived competence and my unseen diligence was glaring, yet socially invisible. It was a tension that bred quiet frustration, but also a certain clarity. I understood the difference between appearance and reality, between those who assume authority and those who actually wield it. And so, over the years, a pattern solidified. Charm and manipulation on his part, loyalty and silent oversight on mine. Every small betrayal, every overlooked contribution, every slight or indignity accumulated, forming the backdrop for a more significant reckoning. I learned to navigate it, to endure it, to store the knowledge and evidence of my contributions and his missteps. The household was mine in practical terms, even if he assumed otherwise. The control he believed absolute was, in reality, balanced delicately by my awareness, my foresight, and my meticulous care. Looking back, it was a bittersweet tension, a constant oscillation between love and frustration, loyalty and indignation, charm and manipulation. The intimacy we shared was genuine but complicated, and the betrayals were small but insidious. I had invested myself entirely, often at the expense of my own recognition, while he assumed the world owed him compliance, respect, and admiration. And yet, in that careful balance, in that quiet accumulation of control and awareness, I had positioned myself in a way he would never anticipate, an unspoken advantage that would become crucial when the inevitable confrontation arrived. It was in this intimate, tense landscape of shared life that the cracks began to deepen. Each slight, each manipulation, each act of casual dismissal added weight to the growing dissatisfaction. My patience, tested daily, had a limit, and the foundation of trust, once assumed unbreakable, was now fissured. The stage was set for a revelation, a confrontation that would bring all these hidden dynamics to light. I knew even then that the equilibrium could not hold indefinitely. The simmering resentment, carefully stored and managed, was quietly gathering strength, preparing for a moment when it would no longer be contained. And so, within this house filled with memories of laughter, love, compromise, and subtle betrayal, I existed in duality, the obedient, loyal partner he saw and the quiet, vigilant steward of my own life and agency. The contrast between appearance and reality, between his charm and manipulation, between my loyalty and frustration, had become the framework for what was to come. I understood deeply that love without awareness could be exploited, and that patience without foresight could lead to vulnerability. Yet, I had prepared, meticulously and deliberately, for the day when the cracks in trust would demand confrontation for the day when the simmering resentment would transform into decisive action, and for the moment when the power he assumed was his would be revealed as mine all along. It started with a ping on my phone, a vibration so ordinary that I almost ignored it. But something about that little sound felt different that morning, sharper, as if it carried a warning. I unlocked the screen and froze, the words before me like shards of glass piercing straight through the calm I had tried so hard to maintain. There it was, a string of messages, casual in tone, intimate in content, confirming what my instincts had whispered for months, but what I had refused to believe outright. Each line was a deliberate betrayal, a hidden life laid bare in text, exposing the duplicity I had somehow managed to deny. I read and reread again, hoping, praying that there was some mistake. But there was none. The evidence was irrefutable, undeniable, and devastating. My chest tightened. The air seemed to thicken around me, and I could feel a rush of heat creeping across my face. How had I not seen this? How had I, who prided myself on attentiveness, on reading subtle cues, missed the signs that had been screaming at me for months? And yet, even in the shock, there was a surreal detachment, a way my mind tried to process the impossible. The man I had trusted implicitly, the man whose charm and seeming devotion had drawn me into this marriage, had been living a lie right under my nose. I felt an immediate wave of hurt, a combination of raw emotional pain and the humiliation of realizing how easily I had been deceived. I turned slowly, almost mechanically, to face him. He was leaning casually against the doorframe, that same confident, smug expression I had come to despise, as if he had been waiting for this moment, as if he knew that when the truth emerged, I would be too stunned, too paralyzed by disbelief to react. The contrast between his composed arrogance and my shaking hands, my racing heartbeat, could not have been more stark. Every betrayal he had committed suddenly seemed amplified by his audacity, by the ease with which he carried himself as though he had done nothing wrong. The humiliation cut deeper than the betrayal itself. I wanted to speak, to scream, to demand explanations, but the words would not come. My voice caught somewhere in my throat, strangled by a combination of shock and anger. My mind, desperate for logic, tried to find a rational explanation, some misunderstanding, some innocuous interpretation of words I now knew were laced with deceit. But there was no misreading here. The texts, the timestamps, the intimate details, all of it pointed to a reality I could no longer ignore. I had been betrayed in the most personal, intimate way possible, and the man responsible stood there as if expecting my submission, as if believing he could dictate my response. I can't believe this, I managed to whisper, my voice trembling despite my attempts at composure. He shrugged lightly, the gesture casual and dismissive, as though my disbelief was a performance he had grown tired of watching. Believe it, he said flatly, almost with a hint of amusement, as if the very idea of my emotional turmoil entertained him. The words were like salt poured into an open wound. I realized in a single devastating moment that this man did not merely betray me. He reveled in the control he assumed he still held over me. The humiliation was compounded by the brazen manner in which he carried himself. "You're overreacting," he said, leaning forward, his tone mocking, as if he were correcting a child's misunderstanding. "It's not that big of a deal. You're taking this too seriously. Maybe it's time you left before this gets messy." The casual cruelty of the statement, the way he framed his infidelity as minor and my outrage as unreasonable, left me stunned. He was not only unrepentant, but also confident that I would shrink, that I would vacate the space I had called home without a fight. The audacity of it, the sheer arrogance, forced my mind into rapid-fire calculations. Anger, betrayal, and humiliation collided with clarity and strategy in a way that both shook and empowered me. For a long moment, silence stretched between us, thick and oppressive, filled only with the sound of my heartbeat and the soft hum of the refrigerator. I stared at him, trying to decipher any hint of regret, any flicker of shame, any trace of the man I had once believed loved me. But there was nothing. He was a fortress of arrogance and entitlement, a man confident that betrayal granted him immunity, that his perceived authority over me was absolute. The contrast between his cold, calculated demeanor and my internal storm could not have been more pronounced. I felt every past slight, every tiny act of dismissiveness, every subtle manipulation rise to the surface, forming a mosaic of anger, hurt, and determination that demanded acknowledgement. My mind, though overwhelmed with emotion, began to sharpen, even as tears threatened to fall, even as my throat burned with the effort of suppressing a scream. I recognized a truth that the smug confidence before me could not anticipate. I held power he had forgotten, power he had underestimated entirely. The house, the physical space, the financial reality, the legal ownership was mine. Every document, every deed, every record of responsibility I had meticulously maintained over the years meant that, despite his bluster, I was not vulnerable in the way he assumed. The realization was a spark, a surge of quiet, focused energy that cut through the fog of betrayal and humiliation. He noticed the subtle change in my expression, the shift from stunned disbelief to concentrated awareness, and his smirk faltered slightly. I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, fleeting but unmistakable. "What are you thinking?" he asked, voice tinged with an edge of defensiveness. I didn't answer immediately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle him. The contrast between his expectation of immediate submission and my newfound composure was electric. He had assumed he would dictate my reaction, and yet here I was, standing, trembling but unbroken, calculating my next move with precision. The humiliation I felt, being mocked for my naivety, being told to leave the home I had helped build, being confronted with betrayal so brazen, was now intertwined with empowerment. Every act of deceit, every hidden infidelity, every dismissive glance from the past contributed to a growing sense of clarity. I realized that the power dynamic, though temporarily skewed in his favor, had never truly left my hands. I had maintained control in ways he could not perceive, and that invisible leverage was now my strongest weapon. The tables, though he could not yet see it, were beginning to turn. Anger flared, sharp and undeniable, yet it was tempered by the strategic awareness that had developed over years of careful observation. I could feel the contrast within me, the loyal, trusting partner who had been blindsided versus the vigilant, capable woman who had quietly built a fortress of security and foresight. This duality, once a source of quiet frustration, now became a source of strength. The betrayal that had seemed like a devastating defeat was, in truth, the catalyst for a reckoning that he could never anticipate. "You really think this intimidates me?" he asked, attempting to reassert dominance, his voice loud and calculated. But it was too late. I had already moved past the initial shock, past the visceral pain, and into a space of deliberate power. I knew exactly what he assumed about me, about my willingness to submit, about my naivety. And I knew with a quiet satisfaction that every assumption he had made was wrong. The humiliation he sought to impose, the command to leave, the mocking tones, the casual dismissal was now rendered meaningless in light of the truth I held. He had overestimated his authority and underestimated my control. I took a deep breath, steadying my racing heart, and allowed myself to look around the house, seeing it not merely as walls and furniture but as a symbol of the careful, deliberate investment I had made in our life. Every room, every decision, every document was a testament to my agency and foresight. He may have believed he could erase my presence with a command, may have thought he could humiliate me into submission, but he had no idea that the foundation he presumed absolute was entirely mine to control. The realization was empowering, a profound contrast to the helplessness I had felt just moments before. The subtle psychological game he had been playing for years now seemed almost pathetic in its transparency. Every gesture of charm, every manipulation, every sly dismissal could be reframed in my mind as evidence not of my vulnerability, but of his overconfidence, of the gaps in his understanding, of the mistakes he had made in underestimating me. I felt the faint thrill of anticipation, a quiet satisfaction that, despite the sting of betrayal, the ultimate leverage remained in my hands. The humiliation was no longer purely destructive. It was instructive, a map of the miscalculations I could now exploit. I imagined the possibilities, each scenario unfolding in careful detail. Him attempting to assert control, me calmly dismantling his assumptions, him flaunting arrogance only to be confronted with the undeniable truth of my authority, him expecting submission while I stood firm, unshaken, and unbowed. The contrast was intoxicating. The betrayal he had relied upon versus the power he had failed to perceive, the humiliation he intended versus the empowerment I now claimed. The emotional intensity of the moment, combined with the clarity of opportunity, left me simultaneously furious, exhilarated, and determined. Finally, I spoke, my voice quiet but unwavering. "You've underestimated me," I said, letting each word settle deliberately in the air between us. His brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of confusion passing across his face, and I knew then that the first cracks in his armor were appearing. I held the evidence in my mind, the texts, the infidelity, the audacity of his command to leave, and framed them not as a submission to his authority, but as proof of the miscalculations he had made. The emotional balance had shifted, and even he could sense it. The stage was set. The inciting incident, the revelation of betrayal, the exposure of infidelity, the mocking humiliation, had delivered its full emotional impact. Yet it had also illuminated the ultimate truth. I still held the reins, still commanded the space, still possessed the quiet, unacknowledged power that would allow me to navigate the situation on my terms. The shock and pain were real, visceral, and undeniable, but they had given way to strategic awareness. I was no longer merely a victim of circumstance. I was the architect of the next moves, the holder of leverage, the possessor of truth he could not erase. And as he waited, confident in his assumed victory, I allowed a slow, deliberate pause, letting the tension stretch between us. He did not yet know the full extent of what I understood, the subtle dominance I had maintained, the foundation of authority he had ignored. The tables, once skewed in his favor, were quietly tilting. Every act of betrayal he had committed had inadvertently prepared me for this moment. Every slight had strengthened my resolve, and every instance of hubris had provided insight into how to reclaim control. In that charged, silent space, I recognized that the narrative of our marriage was no longer dictated by him. I had the power, the clarity, and the leverage, and in that moment, amid hurt, anger, disbelief, and the sting of humiliation, I realized the most important truth: the house. The legal and practical foundation of our shared life was mine. The command to leave, the mocking tones, the casual dismissal, none of it could change that fact. And with that realization, the initial shock of betrayal began to transform into something far more potent, a quiet, deliberate preparation for the reckoning to come. The inciting incident had struck, and I was ready. The hours after discovering his betrayal felt surreal, like walking through a hall of mirrors where every reflection was distorted, every angle sharp, every glance at him fracturing into 1,000 possibilities. He moved through the house with the same casual arrogance, as though nothing had changed, as though our marriage was still the polished facade he had carefully curated for years. But everything had shifted in the blink of an eye. I watched him, noting the ease with which he assumed authority, the way he expected compliance, the way he floated through rooms as though ownership were a birthright. Every movement, every glance, every shrug carried the arrogance of a man who believed the world, and I was entirely his to command. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't match his gestures with raised voices or frantic accusations. I stood in quiet observation, letting him reveal himself in ways impossible to ignore. His smirk, once charming, now felt grotesque. Every casual comment, every dismissal, every half-laugh meant to cut my composure became a mirror reflecting his insecurity and entitlement. The contrast between his confidence and my simmering awareness was stark. He assumed dominance, while I quietly catalogued leverage. I felt a surge of power building, subtle at first, a whisper under the storm of humiliation and anger. "You're still standing there?" he asked, mockery laced in every syllable. "After everything, honestly, I expected more drama. Maybe some tears, a little begging. I thought you'd be gone by now." The words were designed to wound, to belittle, to undermine any sense of authority I had regained since uncovering his betrayal. But I didn't falter. My composure remained deliberate, quiet, an invisible line of steel beneath my skin. His arrogance, meant to intimidate, only sharpened my focus. The more he tried to assert dominance, the clearer it became that his sense of entitlement was built entirely on assumptions. Assumptions I had long ago learned to exploit in my favor. He advanced, steps slow and deliberate, measuring the exact moment to land the next verbal blow. "You really think standing there staring at me changes anything?" His eyes flashed, part incredulity, part challenge. "This is my house, my rules. Don't forget it." His attempt to intimidate was transparent, almost theatrical, yet effective for anyone who didn't know the truth. But I did. I had quietly maintained the documents, the financial oversight, the legal authority, every detail ensuring he could never claim absolute power. And now, as he moved closer, I felt that invisible foundation hum beneath my calm exterior. "I've never doubted my authority," I said softly, carefully measured, letting each word land with quiet precision. "And yet, here you are, assuming you can erase me with a word." The silence that followed was thick, charged with tension. His smirk faltered just slightly, the first crack in his veneer of certainty. He tried to laugh it off, a nervous, clipped sound, but it lacked the ease of before. Somewhere deep, he realized the game had shifted. I was no longer passive. I was awake, aware, and dangerously strategic. The arguments that followed were subtle but intense, psychological warfare wrapped in the guise of domestic confrontation. He attempted every tactic he had perfected over the years: belittlement, gaslighting, casual mockery. "I don't know why you're making such a big deal," he said at one point, leaning casually against the doorway. "It's not like anything's really changed. Maybe you're overreacting. Maybe you're too sensitive." The words, meant to destabilize me, only fueled the quiet fire within. I cataloged every inflection, every pause, every hint of defensiveness. His hubris, meant to intimidate, revealed more about his insecurities than it did about me. Each attempt he made to assert dominance was a roadmap, a guide to his weaknesses. He relied on assumptions, that I would cower, that humiliation would suppress my strategy. But I had seen this pattern before: charm masking manipulation, authority masking insecurity, arrogance masking fear. The contrast between his perception and my reality was staggering. Every time he tried to belittle me, I felt quiet satisfaction. The power he assumed he had was conditional, fragile, entirely dependent on my acquiescence. And I would not acquiesce. There were moments when he escalated, pushing boundaries with a sharpness designed to provoke tears or retreat. "Maybe you should pack a bag," he said casually, like offering a choice that wasn't really a choice. "I can make it easier for both of us. Just admit you're out of place here." The audacity stunned me, but beneath the shock, beneath the humiliation, I felt clarity. He assumed I had no awareness of my leverage, no capacity to assert control quietly, no strategic foresight. He was wrong, and that knowledge, subtle and intoxicating, was a quiet weapon. I began to manipulate the space itself, subtly asserting presence without raising my voice. I moved through the house deliberately, placing items where they would be noticed, checking rooms with calm precision. I allowed him to watch, unaware that each step, each gesture, each careful movement was a demonstration of agency and strategy. The power dynamic was shifting, and he could not perceive it. The contrast between his assumed control and my silent dominance deepened. Every glance, every gesture reinforcing the tension in ways words alone could not achieve. He tried again, with casual cruelty wrapped in charm. "You think you're clever," he said, eyes narrowing. "All this calm composure, all this quiet strategy, It's just theater. You'll crack eventually. But I didn't. I allowed the statement to hang, heavy with irony. I didn't need to argue or defend myself. My presence, my deliberate calm, my knowledge of the foundation of our life was enough. The contrast between his arrogance and my quiet confidence became a psychological battleground, one where silence and observation carried more weight than words ever could. Tension escalated as the day wore on. Small provocations, carefully calculated insults, attempts to undermine my confidence, all became fodder for growing awareness of leverage. Every microaggression, the casual reference to shared spaces, the mocking tone, repeated commands to leave, clarified the gap between perception and reality. He believed he held the reins. I knew otherwise. Each argument, each belittling comment, became a rehearsal for the moment when strategy would replace reaction, when composure would transform into decisive action. Even simple tasks became stages for psychological interplay. He moved through the kitchen, suggesting meals with an air of condescension, dismissing my input as irrelevant. I observed silently, noting not only his patterns but the subtle ways he assumed compliance. Every gesture, every inflection, every glance revealed layers of overconfidence, a reliance on the assumption that I would act predictably. The contrast was stark, his sense of entitlement versus my hidden awareness, his arrogance versus my quiet strength. The more he tried to dominate, the more visible his vulnerabilities became. I cataloged every slight, every dismissive remark, every attempt at control. Each one was a piece of evidence, a blueprint for future action. The humiliation, the mocking, the commands, the belittling assumptions was no longer purely destructive. It had become instructive, shaping my awareness, honing my strategy, preparing me for the moment when the balance would tip decisively in my favor. We moved through the day in tense oscillation, his provocations, my quiet defiance. At one point, he cornered me near the living room, arms crossed, smirk on his face. "You really think standing there, silently judging me, changes anything?" he asked. "You're still trapped in your illusions. The house, the money, everything. You can't escape what I've built." I let the words wash over me, my composure deliberate, a shield forged from years of observation and quiet authority. His assumptions, his casual threats, his arrogance, they all underscored a truth he could not perceive. The house, the leverage, the ultimate control, had never truly been his to dictate. I responded not with anger or tears, but with deliberate calm. "You assume control is yours?" I said slowly, letting each word land. "Control is only real when it is recognized. And you've forgotten one crucial truth. This house, everything in it, every measure of authority you believe you hold, rests on foundations I maintain." The pause that followed was potent. I could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, a microsecond of recognition that perhaps the illusion of dominance had always been precisely that, an illusion. The psychological games continued, escalating subtly. He attempted mockery, feigned confidence, even small threats designed to provoke fear or submission. But I had moved beyond reaction. Each move he made, each slight, each command, only reinforced my awareness of leverage. Every humiliation became a step toward reclaiming authority. By evening, the tension had reached a boiling point. The air was charged, thick with unspoken conflict, the house itself a stage for the quiet warfare unfolding between us. He was confident, smug, unyielding in his assumptions. I was calm, composed, quietly potent, aware of the full extent of my leverage, and ready for the moment when patience would give way to deliberate action. The contrast could not have been more pronounced. His arrogance, absolute and brittle against my hidden strength, deliberate and unassailable. I realized that the breaking point was approaching. The simmering frustration, the humiliation endured, and the betrayal revealed had all sharpened my awareness, focused my strategy, and prepared me for decisive action. By nightfall, I moved through the house with deliberate calm, observing, noting, strategizing. He assumed I was passive, compliant, still processing the emotional upheaval. And yet, with each step, each glance, each careful maneuver, I reclaimed authority not with words, but with presence. The contrast between his assumed power and my quiet, methodical control was undeniable. He could provoke, belittle, mock all he wanted, but the ultimate leverage, the foundation of control he had never recognized, was mine. Conflict, when navigated with patience, observation, and awareness, could be transformed from humiliation into strategy. The rising conflict had served its purpose, escalating tension, revealing weaknesses, clarifying power dynamics. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. The breaking point was near, and with it would come the opportunity to transform years of subtle manipulation and betrayal into decisive, undeniable leverage. The stage was set, the players defined, and the contrast between arrogance and composure, entitlement and hidden strength, had never been more stark. The night was long, stretched thin with silence and unspoken war. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the shadows shifting with every flicker of streetlight outside. His words replayed endlessly in my mind. Every insult, every command, every mocking laugh. Each one burned like acid on my skin. I had endured humiliation before, countless times over the years, but tonight was different. Tonight the betrayal was fresh, raw, undeniable. He had shown me exactly what he thought of me: disposable, weak, irrelevant. For hours I let the rage pulse through me. It rose in waves, thick and suffocating, until I felt I might drown beneath it. But then something shifted. Beneath the anger, beneath the humiliation, a strange clarity began to form. The emotions that once held me hostage, fear, shame, self-doubt, no longer had the same hold. They began to harden into something sharper, something more deliberate. Resolve. He slept soundly beside me, breathing steady, as though nothing had happened. His arrogance was astonishing. He truly believed I would obey, that I would pack my things and leave without resistance. He imagined himself untouchable, a king in a castle built on lies and entitlement. But in the dark, staring at his oblivious form, I realized with crystalline certainty, this was the breaking point. I would not be erased. I would not surrender my dignity, my place, or my power. The next morning, he tested me again. He seemed almost amused by my silence, mistaking composure for defeat. "Still here?" he said, sipping his coffee with infuriating ease. "I thought we talked about this. You really should consider leaving before things get uncomfortable." His words were sharp, but delivered with that insufferable calm that had once disarmed me. Now it only fueled the fire burning in my chest. I met his gaze for the first time, steady and unflinching. "Uncomfortable?" I asked softly. "For who?" The cup paused halfway to his lips. For just a moment there was a flicker, hesitation, confusion, but then the smirk returned. "For you, obviously. You don't belong here anymore." Those words hit harder than any insult before. Not belong, as though the years I had invested in this marriage, the sacrifices, the loyalty, the love, had meant nothing. As though I was a guest in my own home. My hands trembled, not with weakness, but with contained fury. This was the edge of the cliff. Either I let him push me over, or I learned to fly. Memories flashed in my mind, sharp and unforgiving. The first time he had mocked me in front of friends, brushing it off as a joke. The nights he came home late, smelling of perfume that wasn't mine. The casual dismissals of my opinions, the subtle erasures of my presence. I had excused them all, rationalized them as stress, as quirks, as fleeting mistakes. But now, in the blinding light of betrayal, they all aligned into one undeniable truth. This was not love. This was control. The humiliation he thought he inflicted on me was already transforming into something else. Every insult he threw became a brick in the wall of resolve I was building around myself. Every dismissal became a reminder of the power he underestimated. The breaking point wasn't about collapsing, it was about evolving. And in that moment, I felt myself harden into someone new. By midday, the arguments escalated. He seemed intent on grinding me down, testing my endurance. "You can't seriously think you'll win this," he sneered. "I've always been the one in control. You're just—" "Here, you're replaceable. Replaceable." That word hung heavy in the air, a dagger twisted slowly in my chest. For years, I had feared being seen as dispensable, as invisible. Now, confronted with the word in its rawest form, I felt its power dissolve. Replaceable? No, I was irreplaceable in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend. I laughed then, quiet, sharp, unexpected. His face shifted, confusion flickering across his features. "What's funny?" he demanded, irritated by my composure. "You," I said simply. "The way you speak with so much certainty about things you don't actually control. It's almost sad." The smirk faltered again, but he quickly recovered. "You're delusional. You've lost everything and you don't even see it yet." "Or maybe," I replied, leaning forward just slightly, "you've lost everything. And you don't even know it yet." The silence that followed was heavy, electric. For the first time, I saw a crack in his armor of arrogance. He looked at me longer than usual, as though trying to decipher a code he had never bothered to learn. I didn't flinch. I held his gaze, calm and unyielding, letting him feel the shift he couldn't yet name. By evening, my breaking point had crystallized into resolve. I no longer saw myself as the betrayed, humiliated wife. I was the strategist, the architect of what would come next. His insults no longer stung. They bounced off the armor I had forged in the furnace of betrayal. Every word he spoke revealed his blindness. He had no idea the foundation he stood on was crumbling, that I held the keys to everything he thought he owned. That night, as he once again sprawled on the couch, laughing at his phone, I walked the house deliberately. Every room, every corner, every detail reminded me of the truth. This was my domain. The deed, the ownership, the leverage, all mine. He had mocked me, humiliated me, tried to erase me, but he had built his arrogance on a lie. And soon, that lie would collapse in front of him. Standing in the doorway of the bedroom, I whispered the words to myself like a vow. I will not leave. Not this house, not this life, not on his command. If anyone is leaving, it will be him. And when he goes, it won't be in silence. It will be in shame. It was the first time I said it aloud, the first time I allowed the truth to fully take form. The breaking point had not destroyed me. It had transformed me. From this moment forward, I was no longer the quiet, passive figure in his story. I was the author of the ending he never saw coming. And as I turned off the light and prepared for what would come next, one thought burned brighter than all the rest. The time for endurance was over. The time for revelation was near. The morning light spilled across the living room like a silent witness, catching the edges of his arrogance as he stretched lazily across the couch. He had spent the night there, not out of shame, but out of a smug belief that he was the master of this house, and I was already fading into irrelevance. He hadn't packed my things, not yet. He was savoring the process, relishing each opportunity to remind me that my time here was coming to an end. But I had reached my limit. The breaking point had hardened into clarity. Today would not be another day of humiliation. Today would be the day the ground shifted beneath his feet. I entered the room calmly, carrying a folder I had kept hidden for years, one I rarely opened because it reminded me of choices I had made long ago, when love still felt like safety. His eyes flicked toward me, bored, dismissive. "What now?" he asked. "Another speech? Or are you finally ready to be reasonable and pack your things?" I set the folder down on the coffee table with deliberate care. "Actually," I said softly, "I came to remind you of something." He smirked, that infuriating, self-satisfied curve of his lips. "And what would that be? That you still think you have a say in this?" "No," I said, sliding the folder toward him. "That I own this house." The smirk froze. His eyebrows knit together, as though I had spoken in another language. He stared at me, waiting for the punchline, convinced this was a bluff. I didn't flinch. I held his gaze, calm and steady, while his hand hesitated before touching the folder. "What the hell are you talking about?" he asked finally, voice sharp, defensive. Exactly what I said, I replied. This house, this property, every inch of it is in my name. Not yours. It always has been. He barked a laugh, loud and forced. That's ridiculous. You think you can scare me with some papers? Please. But there was a crack in his voice, a quiver he couldn't hide. He opened the folder, flipping through the documents with growing urgency. His hands, once so steady, began to tremble as he scanned the signatures, the stamped seals, the undeniable proof. The silence that followed was almost intoxicating. I watched his arrogance crumble in real time, piece by piece, as disbelief sank into his features. His eyes darted back and forth between me and the papers, desperate for some flaw, some loophole, some salvation. But there was none. This can't be right, he muttered. There must be a mistake. Where are my documents? Where's my name? I stepped closer, my voice steady, deliberate. Your name was never there. From the beginning, I protected myself. You were too busy enjoying the life I built for you to notice. You thought you were the king of this castle, but it was never your kingdom. It was mine. His face flushed red, anger rising to replace the disbelief. You lied to me, he spat. All these years, you let me think. I didn't let you think anything, I cut in sharply. You assumed. You always assumed that I was weak, that I was dependent, that I couldn't survive without you. You never bothered to ask the truth. You just believed your own illusions because they made you feel powerful. The words hung in the air like a blade. He slammed the folder shut, shoving it back across the table as though rejecting the reality it contained. This changes nothing, he snapped, though his voice betrayed him. You think a few papers make you strong? You're still nothing without me. For the first time, I laughed. Not bitterly, not cruelly, but with a freedom I hadn't felt in years. Nothing without you? I repeated. You've just learned that everything you thought was yours belongs to me. And you still think I need you? The panic he tried to hide was seeping through now, tightening his jaw, narrowing his eyes. He stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. You can't do this, he muttered. You can't just throw me out. People will talk. They'll think I'm weak. Exactly, I said quietly. They'll see you for what you are. Weak, dependent, a fraud living in a house he never owned. He froze, the words cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. His whole identity, his status, his pride, his imagined authority was collapsing. And the beauty of it was that I didn't need to shout, didn't need to humiliate him with grand gestures. The truth itself was enough. You planned this, he accused suddenly, desperation rising in his tone. You were just waiting for a moment like this, weren't you? You wanted to embarrass me. No, I said calmly. I wanted to protect myself. I never planned to use it against you. But you forced my hand. You wanted me gone, and now you realize you're the one who doesn't belong here. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. For years he had spoken to me with confidence, always certain that he was in control. Now, for the first time, he had no words, no script, no power. I leaned forward slightly, my voice low, deliberate. If you want to leave, you can. If you want to stay, that's another conversation. But what you will not do is order me out of my own house. Not today, not ever. His jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. He wanted to rage, to scream, to shatter the illusion that had just crumbled around him. But he couldn't. The papers were undeniable. The truth was immovable. His arrogance had been built on sand, and now the tide had come in. For me, the shift was exhilarating. The years of silence, of endurance, of humiliation had led to this moment. I was no longer on the defensive. I was standing on solid ground, while he scrambled to find footing on air. As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the house shifted palpably. His movements became restless, jittery, his confidence shattered. He muttered under his breath, made phone calls he didn't finish, tried to bury himself in distractions. But no matter what he did, the truth loomed over him. He was powerless here. I, on the other hand, moved with deliberate ease. Every step I took through the house felt like a reclamation, a reminder that this was mine. The furniture, the walls, the air itself seemed to hum with vindication. For the first time, I felt the weight of ownership not just legally, but emotionally. This was no longer just a house. It was my stage, my shield, my weapon. That night, he confronted me again, desperation cracking through his voice. "You can't tell anyone," he said, almost pleading. "If people find out, they'll think I'm pathetic. They'll think you're the one in charge." I looked at him steadily, letting the silence stretch until he squirmed. "That's because I am," I said softly. The fury in his eyes was matched only by the fear he tried to conceal. He knew the truth now, and nothing he did could change it. The balance of power had shifted forever. As I turned away, heading upstairs with measured calm, I felt the transformation complete itself. I was no longer the humiliated wife, no longer the woman silenced by betrayal. I was the owner, the strategist, the force he had underestimated for far too long. And deep down, he knew it too. He had always believed that raising his voice was enough to secure victory. That intimidation, sneers, and dismissive laughter could silence me into submission. For years I had played the role he assigned, quiet, patient, forgiving. But on this night, as the walls of our home held echoes of his betrayal, I was no longer the woman who bowed to arrogance. I was something else, calm, sharp, and armed with truth. I waited until his pacing stopped, until his angry mutters about my leaving tomorrow filled the room like smoke. That was when I set the folder down on the coffee table, its weight louder than his words. His eyes darted to it, curious, then dismissive. "What's this?" he asked, his tone dripping with impatience. I folded my hands and leaned back in the chair, meeting his gaze without flinching. "The answer to your fantasy," I said softly. "The one where you throw me out of my house," he scoffed, leaning forward. "Your house? Don't embarrass yourself. Everything here is mine. I paid for the furniture, the bills, I cut him off, not with raised volume, but with measured finality. "The house isn't yours. It never was. The deed, the mortgage, the title, they've always been in my name." The room seemed to freeze. His mouth opened, then closed again, like a man who'd been slapped mid-sentence. A small, bitter laugh escaped him, but it was shaky. "You're lying. You think some bluff is going to scare me? Check for yourself," I said, nudging the folder closer. He hesitated, his arrogance colliding with an unfamiliar fear. Slowly, he opened the folder. Inside were copies of the original mortgage papers, the deed stamped and signed, my name bold at the top. His face drained of color as he flipped through page after page, searching for a loophole that didn't exist. This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "It makes perfect sense," I said, my voice steady. "I bought this house with my savings, my credit, and my name on every line. You've been living here because I allowed it, not the other way around." He slammed the folder shut, breathing hard. "You tricked me. You set me up." "No," I corrected, my calmness slicing deeper than anger ever could. "I trusted you to be a husband. You failed. The ownership was never a trick. It was insurance. Insurance against exactly this moment." For the first time, his posture faltered. The man who once strutted through rooms like a king now looked like a gambler caught cheating. "You can't just throw me out," he stammered. "Can't I?" I asked. "Do you want me to call the police right now? Tell them a man is refusing to leave my property? Because legally, that's exactly what you are now, an unwanted occupant. A squatter." The word squatter hit him like a slap. He tried to regain his footing, forcing a smirk. "You wouldn't dare. You don't have it in you." I leaned forward, lowering my voice to a whisper sharp enough to pierce his bravado. "You've underestimated me your entire life. That ends tonight." His mask cracked, but I didn't stop there. Humiliation alone wasn't enough. Not for the years of manipulation, the betrayal that dripped like poison into every corner of my marriage. He needed exposure. He needed to face the audience of truth. So, with deliberate calm, I picked up my phone and pressed play. The audio messages I'd found earlier, the ones where he whispered lies into another woman's ear, now filled the living room with their sickening intimacy. His face twisted, horror replacing arrogance. Turn that off! He barked, lunging forward. I held the phone out of reach, my eyes never leaving his. No, you need to hear yourself. And so does everyone else. He froze. Because in that moment, he realized what I'd already done. The group chat with his family, his mother, his brother, his closest friends, was already open on my phone. The audio was already sent. You didn't, he whispered, voice trembling. I did, I said. They know. They've heard what kind of man you really are. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the sound of his shallow breathing. He looked like a man drowning in air, searching for ground beneath feet that no longer touched the earth. You're going to regret this, he spat, but his voice shook. No, I replied with icy finality. You will. The confrontation stretched late into the night. He begged, threatened, bargained. He tried every tactic, reminders of good times, promises to change, even pitiful tears. But each attempt slid off me like water against stone, because I wasn't the same woman anymore. For every insult he hurled, I reminded him of the ownership documents. For every attempt at guilt, I reminded him of his infidelity. For every plea for another chance, I reminded him that choices have consequences, and his had finally caught up with him. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains as his voice cracked in desperation outside the front door, suitcase in hand. He begged me one last time, "Don't do this. Don't ruin me." I stood framed in the doorway, calm and unyielding. I didn't ruin you. You did that yourself, and with that, I shut the door. The reversal was complete. He had started the night ordering me to leave. By dawn, he was the one cast out, stripped of power, exposed for the fraud he was. I walked through the quiet house, my footsteps echoing against hardwood that suddenly felt like mine in a way it never had before. Not just legally, but spiritually. The walls no longer carried his arrogance. The rooms no longer echoed with manipulation. This was my home, my sanctuary, my stage of vindication. And as the morning light spilled through the windows, I felt the weight of years lift from my chest. I had not only survived his betrayal, I had conquered it. The silence after his departure was almost startling. For years, the house had been a stage for his voice, sharp commands, sarcastic remarks, careless laughter that always came at my expense. Now it was still. The quiet wrapped around me like a blanket, unfamiliar but deeply welcome. For the first time in years, I could hear my own thoughts without his interruptions, without his disdain. And those thoughts were clear, sharp, and resolute. This was my home, and I would never again surrender it to arrogance. I walked slowly through each room, touching the furniture, the walls, even the windowsills, as if reacquainting myself with a long-lost friend. The living room, where he once held court like a self-proclaimed king, now belonged to me alone. The kitchen, where I'd cooked countless meals while enduring his indifference, felt brighter, freer. Even the bedroom, which had become a tomb of unspoken betrayal, now whispered something different, a promise of peace, of rest earned, of nights no longer haunted by suspicion. The house itself seemed to exhale, as though relieved to be rid of him. I began reclaiming my space in small, deliberate ways. His clothes were the first to go, folded into bags and placed by the curb with ruthless precision. No tears, no hesitation. Each sweater, each pair of shoes was a piece of a life I no longer owed him. The sight of them piled outside was strangely satisfying, like watching weights fall from my shoulders one by one. His toothbrush in the bathroom cup, gone. His cologne bottles on the dresser, gone. The photos where he pretended to smile, gone. Piece by piece, I was erasing the evidence of his presence, reclaiming the home not just legally but spiritually. By the end of that day, the house no longer bore his shadow. It was mine, fully and without compromise. But the true satisfaction didn't end at the doorstep. Word travels fast, faster when scandal is involved. His family, who once praised him as a charming, successful man, had now heard his betrayal in his own voice. Friends who once admired him now looked at him with pity or disdain. Even his colleagues, I later learned, whispered behind his back about the wife he cheated on. the house he was thrown out of, the reputation he had shattered by his own hand. The man who thought he could humiliate me publicly was now the subject of whispered conversations, sideways glances, and stifled laughter. Social isolation crept in around him like an uninvited guest, and yet I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The justice was poetic enough on its own. His downfall wasn't orchestrated by spite. It was delivered by truth. A truth I had simply chosen to reveal. Meanwhile, my own life began to transform. I no longer moved through rooms cautiously, bracing for criticism. I no longer second-guessed my choices or dimmed my own voice to protect his ego. Instead, I began embracing what he had always feared, my independence. I rearranged the living room, placing my favorite armchair by the window where the sunlight poured in. I filled the kitchen with the sense of meals cooked for myself, meals that tasted like freedom. I repainted the bedroom, choosing colors he once mocked but I adored, soft blues and warm creams that soothed me every night. Even my reflection in the mirror began to change. Where I once saw hesitation, I now saw clarity. Where I once saw someone diminished, I saw someone restored. There were moments, of course, when memories of him tried to creep back in, the early days, the laughter that had once felt genuine. But each time I reminded myself of the truth. That charm had been a mask, a costume hiding entitlement and manipulation. The man I once loved had never truly existed, not in the way I had hoped, and that realization didn't break me. It freed me, because beneath his shadow, I had forgotten the woman I was, the woman capable of building a life, buying a house, standing her ground. I had silenced her voice for years in service of a marriage that only took, never gave. But now her voice was louder, steadier, unafraid. The final closure came not from vengeance, but from peace. One evening, weeks later, I stood at the threshold of the front door, the same doorway where I had once watched him leave with his suitcase and his rage. I stood there as the sunset bathed the house in gold, and I realized something profound. I was no longer reacting to him, no longer shaped by his betrayal or his arrogance. I was simply, behold, the house wasn't just walls and furniture. It was a reflection of survival, of dignity reclaimed, of strength revealed when it mattered most. Every brick, every corner, every window was a reminder that I had endured. I had fought back, and I had won. Not through cruelty, but through truth. As for him, the last I heard, he was living in a cramped rental, bouncing between excuses and half-hearted apologies. His calls, when they came, went unanswered, not because I wanted to punish him, but because there was nothing left to say. His chapter in my life had closed, and I had no intention of reopening it. Let him face the silence of his own making. Let him taste the isolation he once threatened me with. That was his consequence, not handed down by me, but earned through every choice he had made. My story did not end in despair. It ended in strength. I had been told to leave. I had been dismissed, underestimated, betrayed. But in the end, I was the one who stayed. Not just in the house, but in my own life. I reclaimed more than 4 walls and a roof. I reclaimed myself, and as I locked the door that evening, stepping into the quiet embrace of my home, I knew with certainty no one would ever take that from me again. In the quiet days that followed, the house became more than just a shelter. It became a mirror. Every corner reflected not only the pain I had endured, but also the strength I had uncovered. Betrayal leaves scars, but it also etches lessons into the deepest parts of us, lessons we never knew we needed until survival demanded them. At first, I found myself replaying the confrontation like a scene from a film. His face pale with disbelief as the ownership papers lay spread before him. His voice breaking into panic when the truth spread to his family and friends. And that final moment, when the suitcase hit the porch and the door shut behind him. For years he had spoken as though his word was law, as though his power was unshakable. Yet, in a single night, that illusion collapsed. But even as the satisfaction lingered, so did something else, a quieter ache. Because betrayal, no matter how justified the revenge, leaves behind questions. How had I ignored the signs for so long? Why had I convinced myself that patience and loyalty could fix what was broken? And most importantly, why had I allowed myself to be treated as though I were less than what I was? Those questions cut deeper than his insults ever had. They forced me to look inward, not outward. The truth was simple, though not easy to admit. I had underestimated myself just as much as he had. In the beginning, I had excused the red flags. His casual dismissals of my opinions. "You're overreacting." His subtle control over finances. "I'll handle it, don't worry." His unpredictable temper that always left me apologizing first. Each moment taken alone seemed small enough to dismiss. But together, they wove a pattern of control so subtle it felt like normalcy. That's the danger of toxic relationships. They rarely start with grand betrayals. They start with microaggressions, with tiny cracks that widen over time. And if you're loyal, if you're hopeful, you convince yourself that those cracks can be patched, that the foundation can still hold, but it doesn't. It can't. And the longer you deny the truth, the deeper the damage becomes. Looking back, I realized that his greatest weapon had never been his arrogance or his manipulation. It had been my silence, my willingness to absorb pain in the name of keeping peace, my fear of confrontation, my belief that love required sacrifice, even when that sacrifice came at the cost of my own dignity. But betrayal has a way of waking you up. That night, when he told me to leave, something inside me snapped, not in weakness but in clarity. The fog lifted. I saw the relationship not as I wished it to be, but as it truly was. And once seen, it could never be unseen. That clarity was painful, but it was also liberating. I began to reflect not only on what I had lost, but also on what I had gained. I had gained resilience, the kind that only forms in the fire of humiliation and survival. I had gained self-worth, not from his validation, but from the recognition that I had endured and risen stronger. And most importantly, I had gained perspective, the ability to recognize toxicity not as love gone wrong, but as control disguised as intimacy. It was strange, even ironic, to feel gratitude for the very betrayal that had once left me shattered. Without it, I might still be living in his shadow, still confusing endurance for loyalty, still mistaking silence for strength. His betrayal had burned my illusions to ash, but from those ashes I had rebuilt myself. Of course, the scars remained. Healing doesn't erase the memories. It reshapes them. There were still moments when I felt a sting, the memory of laughter shared, the ache of promises broken. But instead of letting those moments drag me back, I used them as reminders that love without respect is hollow. Reminders that sacrifice without reciprocity is exploitation. Reminders that silence in the face of cruelty is not peace, but surrender, and I would never surrender again. There were nights I sat by the window, staring at the world outside, and thought of other women, others who might still be where I once was. Women questioning their worth because of someone else's arrogance. Women silencing themselves in the name of keeping harmony. Women who had not yet discovered the strength that betrayal can reveal. I wanted to reach through the glass, to whisper to them what I had learned. You are stronger than you think. You are worth more than they make you believe. And the moment you stop underestimating yourself is the moment everything changes. Because in the end, this wasn't just about a marriage. It was about identity, about reclaiming not only a house, but a voice, a soul, a life. Even in reflection, I couldn't ignore the poetic justice of it all. He had believed he held all the power, when in reality, the foundation of his arrogance rested on my silence. The moment I broke that silence, the illusion shattered. The image of him standing at the curb with his suitcase will stay with me forever. Not because it gave me joy to see him fall, but because it symbolized a truth I would never forget. Power is not in possession, but in perception. And when you finally see yourself clearly, no one else's perception can control you. Today, when I walk through my home, I no longer see betrayal in the walls. I see resilience, I see lessons written into every room. The living room is no longer a stage for his arrogance. It's a space where I read, write, and laugh freely. The kitchen no longer smells of meals cooked for someone ungrateful. It carries the aroma of meals I create for myself, meals that taste like freedom. The bedroom is no longer a site of silence. It's a sanctuary of peace. And I have peace. Peace that came not from pretending everything was fine, but from confronting the truth and surviving it. Peace that came from realizing I had always held the power. I had just forgotten how to use it. When people ask if I regret the marriage, I answer honestly, no. Because without it, without the betrayal, without the humiliation that drove me to the edge, I would never have discovered the strength that now defines me. Pain has a way of teaching lessons joy never could. Betrayal shows you who someone else truly is. But more importantly, it shows you who you are, and who I am now is someone unafraid. Someone unshaken. Someone who knows that dignity is not something another person can give or take. It is something you claim for yourself. I want to take a moment to speak directly to you, not as a narrator telling a story, but as someone who has lived it. As someone who once felt powerless, humiliated, and betrayed. I want you to imagine this. The person you trusted most, the one you believed would never hurt you, suddenly shows you the darkest side of their heart. The betrayal is sharp, immediate, and undeniable. How would you react? Would you crumble, retreat, and let them dictate your life? Or would you find a hidden strength you didn't know existed, a power buried beneath years of loyalty and compromise? It's not easy to confront. Betrayal cuts deeper than any argument, any insult, any failure. It leaves you questioning your judgment, your worth, and even your ability to navigate the world. You replay the moments, searching for a sign you missed, a warning you ignored. You wonder, could I have done something differently? Could I have prevented this? But here's what I learned, and what I want you to understand. Betrayal is never yours to carry. The deception, the lies, the disregard, they belong entirely to the person who committed them. You may feel shock, anger, sadness, and even guilt, but those emotions are signposts, not chains. They are signals pointing toward your next step, reclaiming your life, your space, and your power. I remember the exact moment I realized I had the power all along. It wasn't in confrontation, or in revenge, or in proving him wrong. It was in understanding the truth. The house, the ownership, the leverage. It was mine, and he had been blind to it. But the deeper realization was even more important. The true ownership, the real power, isn't legal papers or possessions. It's your clarity, your conviction, your refusal to let anyone define your worth. Think about that for a moment. When someone underestimates you, they are giving you an advantage. They are leaving an opening you may never have noticed if everything had been easy. The question is, will you seize it? Will you step into the space they assume you cannot occupy? Or will you allow their misjudgment to shape your life, to dictate your emotions, and to determine your boundaries? Boundaries are vital. They are the invisible walls we construct to protect our dignity and our sanity. Yet so often, betrayal occurs not just because of lies, but because boundaries were ignored, blurred, or silenced. The person who underestimates you often sees those boundaries as weaknesses, thinking you will not enforce them. That is when your strength must emerge, not with rage alone, but with clarity, with decisiveness, and with an unwavering understanding of what you will and will not tolerate. I want you to reflect on your own life. Who has pushed against your boundaries? Who has taken your kindness for weakness, your loyalty for granted, your trust for granted? And crucially, how did you respond? Or how could you respond if you were to reclaim control? It's not just about revenge. That is a trap that can consume you. It's about empowerment, about regaining control over your own narrative. In my story, the house was symbolic, yes, but the real reclamation was emotional and psychological. I was no longer silenced by fear, guilt, or shame. I no longer allowed the shadow of someone else's arrogance to darken my life. I became visible to myself again, fully aware of my worth and my agency. Empowerment is subtle. it doesn't always require confrontation or dramatic gestures. Often, it begins quietly, asserting your boundaries, saying no when it matters, refusing to internalize blame, refusing to let manipulation define your perception of yourself. Every choice to honor your own voice, every act of self-respect, every refusal to let betrayal diminish your presence, these are victories. And cumulatively, they build a life where you are no longer at the mercy of someone else's misjudgment. Now, think about the people around you. Who do you allow to influence your emotions, your decisions, or your self-worth? Betrayal isn't always dramatic. It can be subtle, insidious. It can appear as small lies, dismissals, microaggressions, or manipulations that leave you questioning your value. Identifying toxic patterns before they fully unfold is essential. Awareness is the first step toward reclaiming control, toward ensuring that your power is never underestimated again. And when someone does betray you, remember this: the initial shock, the anger, the humiliation, they are temporary. They are catalysts, not destinations. What matters is how you respond. Will you shrink, retreat, or let the betrayal define you? Or will you rise, reclaim, and rewrite the story on your terms? What would you do if this happened to you? Comment below. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe for more. See you in the next video.